Hello everyone. I wanted to make a video about MGTOW by process of elimination. And what I mean by that is something I've seen for quite a while, but I think this is increasingly common, particularly with men that are already at least somewhat red-pilled, so to speak. And just to be brief about that, what I mean is men that realize that this whole narrative that women are lovely and you should want to build a life with a woman because it just has value in and of itself, and essentially you should want to play your provider protector role because somehow that's the right thing to do. Men that are at least at a point where they reject all this stuff and they see what feminism has done. They see that women have a really major advantage when it comes to a lot of things dealing with relationships and their interactions with men. Guys that are already at a point where they realize that a lot of what they've been taught about where things stand between men and women isn't true, and that to a large extent women have the upper hand now when it comes to gender roles, when it comes to the marriage contract, when it comes to having kids. Women have the upper hand, but these men are not necessarily in any sort of official way or in any way that is necessarily definitive MGTOW. They're not necessarily saying I'll never get married or I'll never have kids or I'll never live with a woman, but they end up essentially embracing those same things throughout their lives anyway, because they look around at the dating scene and at the overall relationship process that we have going on today. That's typical, at least, right? The conventional relationship process. And they realize, you know what? Any of the women that I'd want to date or have a relationship with, they either don't exist or they don't want to be with me or they're married or etc. Like there's just basically no women out there that are available that I'd ever want to be with, even if, I was willing to do that. And to some extent, I can use myself as an example here. I do believe in the general men going their own way philosophy from the standpoint of, I know I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to willingly have kids with anyone. Someone would have to steal my DNA for that to happen, basically. I'm not going to live with a woman because I know that the Duluth model for domestic violence basically means that it's the woman's house. She can call the police and say that you're abusive anytime she wants. So I do believe in these core MGTOW ideas. I do believe that rejecting those ideas of living with a woman, potentially getting married and having kids is the right way to go. But let's just say for me that in the future I'd decide that I'd like to have a girlfriend. Now I'm not saying this will happen, and that's kind of the point of this video, is that it would be very difficult for this to have any sort of real application. But let's just say that I would decide, hypothetically, that I would want to have a girlfriend, and I'm really against the dating market and sort of interacting with that. The whole process of dating is something that I also pretty much reject. But let's just say that I want to have some level of relationship with a girlfriend because I'm using myself as an example of what I think men are going through as a similar process to basically go their own way as a process of elimination. I look around and I see feminist women, all right? There's no way that I would date a feminist woman because feminist women hate men. They're not going to admit that. They may not be consciously aware of that. But when you think that another group of people has oppressed people like you throughout all of history, i.e. patriarchy theory, you essentially are going to hate that group of people. You're never going to respect members of that group. And so feminist women will never respect the men that they're with. They have no problem treating the men they're with poorly because they look down on those men and see them as oppressors. So there's no way on earth that it makes any sense to date a feminist woman. Once you figure out what feminism is, especially like I say, if you're already red-pilled basically, and at that point, you're not going to date a feminist woman because that's absurd once you realize what you would actually be getting into. Let's say you have a traditional conservative woman. I don't want to be with a traditional conservative woman because she's going to expect me to marry her and have kids with her and role play this sort of neo-traditional way of doing things, which, as Turd Flinging Monkey has said in the past when his channel was still up on YouTube with its content, you're just role-playing, right? Anytime she wants, she can just decide that she's going to divorce you anyway, decide that she's going to take the kids and use them as a meal ticket and take half your stuff. So the traditional conservative lifestyle for a guy that's aware of this is really not viable. There's no way that that's not a toxic situation for him to put himself into. So you're not going to play the traditional conservative provider protector role. You're not going to be with a feminist. So those two groups are out. That's the vast majority of women already. Then you have your promiscuous women, regardless of where they are in terms of their political ideology or what they say they want in a relationship. Again, I'm using myself as an example. I don't want to be with a promiscuous woman. There's no way that I would ever want to be in a relationship with a woman that's had more than a few partners. I'm not as strict as some guys who will say, oh, she can only have been with me, right? I don't really care about that in terms of being that stringent with that criterion, but I'm not going to be with a woman that's a slut. Why should I invest in a woman that's given out her sexuality to a bunch of other guys for free? That's dumb. So I would reject being with a woman that's been with more than a few partners. I would reject the traditional conservative women. I would reject women that are feminists. And let me add a couple of other realistic criteria that I have. I wouldn't be with a woman who essentially is an atheist or doesn't have any sort of belief. I would really want to date a Christian woman. But at the same time, even though I still have that belief system, even though I would still want to be with a woman that's a Christian, I wouldn't want to get married. Well, how many Christian women would sign up for that? Does that really make sense for them? It does for a guy, because you know how dangerous marriage is and how you don't really want to do that. But again, even if you would be willing to say, well, all right, I'll sign up for that, but she needs to have a prenup. We need to have a prenup in order for this to work. How many Christian women are going to do that? How many of those women also fall into the traditional conservative category? A lot of them do. So you have the religious aspect of, I wouldn't want to be with a woman that totally discards the idea of having a relationship with God, but I also wouldn't want to be with a woman who wants me to commit to her in some sort of state-sponsored, state-bastardized, really, institution of marriage. So, even if you start off saying, I'd like to get married potentially or have children and whatnot, how do you do that without saying that you're going to be the provider and protector? You can try. You can say that you reject that, but how many women that are Christians are actually going to accept that? A lot of them are traditional conservatives to begin with, but how many Christians are actually going to want to say, you know what, we'll just have a short-term relationship and it'll last as long as it lasts? Some women may be willing to do that. Most of them won't. But I wouldn't want to really be with someone who doesn't believe in God. So that would be one of the criteria. And then you have your more superficial criteria as well, right? Like, it's not superficial in the sense that it doesn't matter, but they're very readily expressed. You look at women that have a bunch of tattoos. I'm not going to be with a woman that has a bunch of tattoos. That's not happening, because that is not something really that I'm attracted to, but the bigger thing is that indicates mental instability in a lot of cases. I wouldn't want to be with a woman that's a single mom. There's no reason to date a woman that has kids if you know that you're never going to be given any sort of authority over those children. Again, you're red-pilled on this. You realize that this is a bad investment. So I look around at these kinds of criteria, guys, and I realize that I wouldn't want to be with the vast majority, if nearly all women. I don't want to be with a woman that's superficial and materialistic either. I would not want to have any sort of connection at that level with a woman where we're in some form of relationship who is super materialistic, is all about how she looks all the time, and is just obsessed with herself, the way that a lot of women are. And I want to make it clear, guys, that I'm not talking about being full of myself and thinking that no girl is good enough for Dan. I would never want to date a woman because they're all bad. It's not even a matter of good and bad necessarily in terms of character. Some of it is character-based, right? But it's not a matter of, oh, I just reject women that aren't good enough for me because I'm so amazing. It's just that relationships have become such a nuisance, and the whole dating process is so fruitless and futile that there's no reason for a lot of men, basically most men, that are aware of this to even engage with the women around them. It's MGTOW by process of elimination. And again, for me personally, I understand and I agree with the overall MGTOW philosophy. But even guys that don't, and this is the point of the video, still end up pretty much going their own way because they look around and they say, you know what, I ain't going to be with a single mom. And the particular criteria don't really matter, right? Those are my criteria that I mentioned. There are others as well that I could add into that if I wanted to make a list, right? But it doesn't matter whether a particular guy says, you know, I don't want to be with a woman that's a total slut, but I wouldn't mind having a slightly larger number of partners than Dan. Or compared to Dan, I would want a woman that's a virgin. It doesn't matter what the criteria are specifically. What matters is if you have reasonable criteria as a man today, nearly all the women around you are instantly eliminated from the dating pool. There's no reason to date a woman with kids if you're not having kids. I might make a video about that in particular at some point. That to me is the best reason for not dating a single mom, rather than trying to analyze their character per se. But again, that's not important here. If you're not dating a single mom, look at how many women that eliminates. If you're not dating a woman that doesn't have particular religious or moral beliefs, look at how many women that eliminates. If you're not going to date a woman that's been divorced, look at how many women that eliminates. The feminist women, or the women that go along with feminism. That's the vast majority of women right there. Some would beg to differ, but especially when you see the number of women that support feminist policies, that's the majority of women. So if you look at all these things and you say, you know, I'm not going to be a traditional conservative guy because there's no reward for me in that. Even if I'd be willing to supposedly, theoretically get married, I'm not going to play the provider protector role. Well, how many women are going to agree to that? Even a lot of the women that identify as feminists, and that's another thing, is a lot of these women fall into several of these categories that are probably deal breakers for a lot of men, including myself, right? I wouldn't consider marriage in general, but if you have a guy that says, I would still be willing to marry the right woman, and then he looks around and most women are either man-hating, right? They're feminists and they hate men, or they expect men to be the providers, protectors, even while at the same time they say that they don't need to do anything for you. Well, what's the point of being in a relationship where you're the only one expected to perform any sort of gender role? That's ridiculous. That's a bad deal right off the bat. And so you can look at this as a guy and realize, don't want to be with the slutty women. Why pay for something that other men got for free? Why do I need to take you out or spend time with you when other men just got to bang you? If that's really all you offer anyway. And even if you offer something else, it's like still, your sexuality is pretty much no longer something of value. So when you add all these kinds of things together, I think what a lot of men realize is that there's very little here. There's very little that's positive in the sense of dating or being in relationships with women anymore. And so you may not outright say, I will never be with a woman in a relationship at all because I accept MGTOW and I don't want to do that. I'm a MGTOW monk. Some men will get to that point, of course, but a lot of guys don't need to, right? A lot of guys will look around and say, well, I'm not necessarily committed to that, but look at the women out here. They either expect me to be a provider and protector in a world where we're supposed to be equal, and that's supposed to not be necessary. Women don't perform any gender roles, so why should I do that? And even if I did, it's just pretty much a pretense, right? It's a matter of we'll do this until you decide to use the feminist courts to basically divorce me and take my kids anyway. So there's no reason to role play the traditional conservative relationship. There's no reason to essentially proceed with a lot of these different women. There's just very little that's actually healthy that's available. And even the women that are looking for one guy and they don't necessarily want you to be a traditionalist, some of them are married, some of them already have kids, so again, whether or not they're also sluts, it doesn't really matter. The bottom line is that there's very little that's positive for the red pill man that's available, to the extent that a lot of men that are not necessarily overtly declaring themselves MGTOW, or even, in their own mind saying, I'm going my own way now because this is all bad, they're not pairing up. They're not going through the whole dating rigmarole. They're not entering into relationships of any form with women because it's a waste of time. And because even if you wouldn't necessarily eliminate all women, there's no women around you that are actually worth dating, so the effect is the same, right? You're not necessarily saying I'm committed to never being with a woman, but at the end of the day, there's nothing there to actually add value to your life. And so a lot of men are, even if they're not declaring themselves men going their own way, they're making very similar decisions for themselves anyway, because they realize that the whole relationship game is pretty shitty for men today. Even the men that still want to have a girlfriend or would be willing to entertain that idea. And so I just wanted to make that point, that I think more and more men are kind of falling into that picture. Right? I've talked about this sort of MGTOW iceberg in the past, where a lot of men are looking around and basically deciding to go their own way. They may not have heard of MGTOW, but they realize that marriage and stuff is just not a positive, viable path for men today that want to have a good life. But you also, I think, have the men that may at some level know what MGTOW is and don't necessarily fully embrace it, but they embrace it anyway in a de facto sense because there aren't any women out there that are really worth dating. And again, it's not a matter of arrogance. It's a matter of the type of criteria that I've talked about here, right? If you have these ridiculous expectations of men the way that a lot of women do without actually offering something positive, then what's the point? It doesn't matter whether you officially say I'll never date or have a girlfriend when it's very difficult and not really worth the time to try to find a woman to have some form of relationship with anyway. And so to conclude the video, I think more and more men are effectively going their own way in this sense, regardless of whether they consider themselves MGTOW or not, because the pool of women that it's worth having any form of relationship with that are actually available to you and may actually like you and want to be with you and not have ridiculous expectations that are one-sided, that pool of women is so small that men are just better off not being in relationships in many cases anyway, even if they would consider that otherwise if the environment were different and if the things between men and women, the sort of situation was different. A lot of guys are looking around and saying, I may not declare myself to be part of this philosophy or viewpoint of, I outright reject marriage and cohabitation and having children, but there aren't any women around me that I want to do that with, and so effectively I'm going to do the same thing anyway. There's more and more men that I think are reaching that type of conclusion, even if they aren't declaring themselves official MGTOW. And even if, whether they've heard of MGTOW or not, they look around as just like the whole dating process and the whole process to try to have a girlfriend is so not worth it that effectively they become very similar to men going their own way, even if that wasn't their intent to start off with.